Hello and welcome. Find a comfortable place, dim the lights, and allow your mind to drift back in time with me. Tonight, our journey does not lead us to the gilded halls of ancient kings or the blood-soaked fields of epic battles. Instead, we travel to a place far more intimate, yet infinitely more enigmatic. We venture into the heart of 20th century America, to a small town nestled in the verdant rolling hills of Appalachia. A town that, for 13 anxious, bewildering months, found itself at the nexus of profound fear, haunting folklore, and a cataclysmic tragedy that would forever scar its collective soul. This is a story that resides in the unsettling gray borderlands between what we can see and what we can feel, between a chilling premonition and a catastrophic reality. It is a story about a creature that defied every law of nature we hold dear, a community gripped by a creeping, inexplicable dread, and a question that still echoes down the decades from those dark hollows. Was it a monster, a messenger from a world unseen, or a shared nightmare born from the deep-seated anxieties of its time? Prepare yourselves, because this is the definitive, unabridged story of the Mothman of Point Pleasant. To truly comprehend the cascade of strange events that began in the autumn of 1966, we must first sink our roots into the soil of the place itself. Our stage is Point Pleasant, West Virginia, a town forged and defined by two powerful elemental forces: its history and its geography. It sits at a crucial confluence, the very point where the deep, green, and storied waters of the Kanawha River surrender themselves to the vast, muddy, and powerful expanse of the mighty Ohio. This meeting of rivers has been the town's lifeblood and its destiny for centuries. Long before the first European boots trod upon this land, it was a vital hub for numerous Native American tribes, a place of trade, of life, and all too often of violent conflict. This legacy of conflict is etched into the town's very name and its foundational myth. In October of 1774, this land was the site of the Battle of Point Pleasant, a brutal and pivotal clash between the Virginia colonial militia and a formidable confederacy of Shawnee and Mingo tribes. The tribes were led by the respected and powerful Shawnee chief, Hokalesqua, known to the settlers as Cornstalk. The battle was a savage, day-long affair that resulted in a victory for the colonists and a devastating blow to the native confederacy, forcing them to cede their hunting grounds in Kentucky. But the story did not end with the treaty. 3 years later, in 1777, with the American Revolution now raging, Chief Cornstalk, had since become an advocate for peace and neutrality, traveled to the American outpost of Fort Randolph, located where Point Pleasant now stands. He came under a flag of truce to warn the colonists that he could no longer restrain the younger warriors of his tribe, who were being incited by the British to attack the settlements. In an act of unfathomable treachery, the fort's commander detained Cornstalk as a hostage. When a local militiaman was killed by unseen native warriors in the woods nearby, the soldiers in the fort, inflamed with rage, ignored all honor and protocol. They stormed the cabin where Cornstalk was being held and murdered him, his son Elenipsico, and another chief named Red Hawk. And it is here, in this moment of betrayal and bloodshed, that the first, deepest layer of our legend is laid. According to local lore, a story whispered from one generation to the next, as he lay dying on the cabin floor, Chief Cornstalk uttered a curse upon the land and the people who had wronged him. He spoke of a dark and blighted future, of a curse that would last for 200 years, bringing sorrow and disaster to the valley for the treachery committed that day. For nearly 2 centuries, this story was a piece of dark local folklore, a ghost story told by the fireside, a way to explain the hardships that seemed to plague the region: the devastating floods, the deadly coal mining disasters, the pervasive sense of economic struggle. It was a local legend, a historical footnote. No one in the mid-20th century could have possibly imagined that some would soon come to believe that Cornstalk's curse had finally taken a physical, terrifying, winged form. By the 1960s, Point Pleasant was, on its surface, a picture of tranquil mid-century Americana. It was a proud, hard-working town of about 6,000 souls. The river barges still chugged along, and industry provided a steady, if not prosperous, way of life. And the most visible, most potent symbol of its modern identity, its proud connection to the rest of America, was the U.S. Route 35 bridge, known to all as the Silver Bridge. Opened to great fanfare on Memorial Day 1928, the bridge was a true engineering marvel of its time. It was the first of its kind in the entire nation, a unique I-bar chain suspension bridge, a design that used long high-tensile steel bars linked together like a bicycle chain instead of the traditional spun wire cables. Its coat of gleaming aluminum paint gave it its iconic name and made it a beloved landmark, shimmering like a silver ribbon in the Appalachian sun. For the people of Point Pleasant and the neighboring communities across the river in Ohio, the Silver Bridge wasn't just a cold structure of steel and concrete. It was a warm, vital lifeline. It was the daily commute to work, the Saturday trip for groceries, the drive to visit family and friends. It was a constant, dependable, and reassuring presence, a testament to progress and connectivity, arching gracefully over the very river that had borne witness to so much of the area's troubled history. But progress always casts a long shadow, and just a few miles north of the town's quiet, tree-lined streets, shrouded by dense forest and largely forbidden to the public, lay a place that was the dark, decaying twin to the bridge's shining promise. This was the West Virginia Ordnance Works, known by everyone for miles around simply as the TNT area. Sprawling over a staggering 8,000 acres of woodland and swamp, this facility was the ghost of a more violent time. Hastily constructed during World War II, it was a massive, top-secret industrial complex dedicated to a single deadly purpose: the manufacture and storage of trinitrotoluene for the war effort. It was a place of immense chemical power, a self-contained city of death dotted with hundreds of concrete storage igloos, a labyrinthine web of crumbling asphalt roads, derelict power plants, and chemical-settling ponds whose toxic contents were a closely guarded secret. After the war, the TNT area was decommissioned and largely abandoned. The government sold off parcels of the land, and a significant portion was designated as the McClintock Wildlife Management Area. But for the most part, it was simply left to rot. Nature began its slow, relentless process of reclamation. Weeds shattered the asphalt roads from below, and thick vines crept like green, silent fingers over the concrete domes, pulling them back into the earth. The colossal windowless power plants stood like skeletal cathedrals to a forgotten industry, their empty halls echoing with the cries of birds and the whisper of the wind. The area became a true liminal space, a zone of eerie silence and palpable decay. For local teenagers, it was a place to test their courage, a secluded lover's lane shrouded in both privacy and a delicious, shivering sense of danger. For hunters, it was a prime location for deer and wild turkey. But for everyone, it was a place with an undeniable atmosphere. The air felt heavy charged. The shadows in the dense woods seemed deeper, more profound. The silence was not peaceful, but watchful and expectant. It was a landscape scarred by the forgotten secrets of war and industrial neglect, a perfect, haunted incubator for a nightmare. And on a cold, starless November night, that nightmare would be given wings and red eyes and a name. The first tremor of the strangeness to come was felt not in Point Pleasant itself, but about 90 miles to the east, near the small, unassuming town of Clendenin. On November 12, 1966, 5 men were working in a local cemetery. They were gravediggers, contracted to prepare a plot for a weekend burial. It was quiet, somber work, the rhythmic scrape and thud of shovels against the damp earth the only sound disturbing the peace of the dead. Suddenly, that silence was utterly broken. From the dense woods that bordered the cemetery, something large and dark burst forth from the trees. It was not a bird they recognized. It was a dark, distinctly human-like shape that launched itself from the tree line. It didn't flap its wings furiously. It swooped, gliding with an uncanny silence and an unnerving, weightless grace just a few feet over their heads before disappearing over the horizon. The men were stunned into silence, their shovels frozen in their hands. They later struggled to find the words to describe it, settling on the baffling and inadequate phrase, a brown human being. The encounter was brief, baffling, and deeply unsettling. These were practical men accustomed to the solemn finality of death, not to dark, flying phantoms emerging from the woods. They spoke of it amongst themselves, confused and unnerved, but the story remained a local curiosity, a strange anecdote shared in hushed tones over a beer. They had no idea that they were the forgotten prologue to a much larger, much darker, and much more public drama. 3 nights later, on the moonless, chilly evening of November 15th, the legend of the Mothman would truly be born. In Point Pleasant, 2 young, recently married couples were out for a drive. In one car were Roger and Linda Scarberry. In the other, their friends Steve and Mary Millette. They were close. Linda and Steve were siblings, and they were doing what bored young people in a small town have always done to pass the time. Driving aimlessly around, looking for friends, simply killing time. Their search for anyone they knew proved fruitless, and as the hour grew late on a whim, they made the fateful decision that would alter their lives and the history of their town forever. They turned their car off the main road and onto the dark, unpaved access roads leading deep into the foreboding TNT area. The atmosphere inside the car shifted immediately. The cheerful chatter died down, replaced by a nervous silence. Their headlights sliced a weak, lonely tunnel through an ocean of oppressive blackness, intermittently illuminating the hulking silent shapes of the abandoned concrete storage igloos, which looked like ancient burial mounds in the fleeting ghostly light. They drove deeper and deeper into the decaying industrial complex, until they approached the skeletal remains of the Old North power plant. And that is when their mundane night was violently, irrevocably shattered. There, standing near the giant, rusting, silent generator, were 2 circles of brilliant, hypnotic light. They were huge, perhaps 6 or 7 inches in diameter, and they glowed with an intense, fiery, and pulsating red. They were not reflecting the car's headlights. They were self-luminous, like 2 burning coals floating in the absolute darkness. For a long moment, the 2 couples just stared, their minds scrambling to process and rationalize what they were seeing. Was it a trick of the light? The reflectors on a piece of abandoned machinery? A strange foxfire phenomenon? But then the lights moved. And as they moved, the inky darkness around them resolved into a solid, terrifying shape. It was a shape that defied all known categories of biology and logic. It was, by all 4 of their later, frantic accounts, the shape of a man. A very large man, standing between 6.5 and 7 feet tall. Its body was a uniform grayish or brownish-gray color, but it had no discernible head, no neck, no arms that they could see. The 2 crimson eyes seemed to be set directly into its upper torso, staring at them with a blank, emotionless, and terrifying intensity. And then, as they watched in frozen horror, a pair of enormous, leathery, bat-like wings slowly unfurled from its back, stretching to a wingspan they estimated to be at least 10 feet wide. The rational world fell away, replaced by a surge of pure, primal reptilian terror. Panic exploded in the car. Roger Scarberry, who was at the wheel, slammed his foot on the accelerator. The tires screamed and spit gravel as he wrenched the car around and raced back towards the relative safety of the main highway, Route 62. They thought they prayed they had left it behind them in the darkness. But as they hit the paved road and began to pick up speed, Linda risked a glance over her shoulder, out the back window. A scream caught in her throat. The thing was airborne, and it was right behind them. Roger pushed the car faster and faster, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, the speedometer needle climbing relentlessly past 80-90, then an unbelievable 100 miles per hour down the dark country highway. The creature kept pace effortlessly. It wasn't flapping its wings furiously like a bird struggling to keep up. It was gliding, its massive form silhouetted against the starless night sky, its motion eerily silent except for the sound of the wind rushing over its vast wings, a sound they later described as a strange mechanical thumping. The four teenagers could hear its cry, a bizarre high-pitched squeaking sound, like a giant mouse or a rusty unoiled hinge, that seemed to emanate from the creature every time Roger swerved to take a sharp turn. At one terrifying point, it swooped low over the car, its massive shadow momentarily engulfing them in complete darkness, its red eyes seeming to peer right through the car's metal roof, right into their souls. This was no fleeting glimpse. This was a relentless pursuit, a chase of impossible speed and otherworldly dread. They finally careened into the city limits of Point Pleasant, the familiar yellow glow of the streetlights offering a fragile, psychological shield against the abomination from the dark. As they reached the edge of town, the creature finally banked away, veering off into the blackness of the countryside as silently and mysteriously as it had appeared. Shaking, hysterical, and gasping for breath, Roger didn't drive anyone home. He drove directly to the Mason County Courthouse. They burst into the sheriff's department, a tangled mess of raw fear, adrenaline, and shared trauma, babbling their incredible, terrifying story to the deputy on duty that night, a man named Millard Halstead. Halstead was a seasoned, level-headed lawman who knew his community inside and out. He knew the Scarberry and Millett families. He knew these four young people were not troublemakers, not pranksters, and not given to wild, elaborate stories. And most importantly, he saw the undiluted, genuine terror in their eyes. Linda was sobbing uncontrollably. The others were pale, their bodies trembling. Their fear was palpable, and it was infectious. Despite the utter mind-bending strangeness of the Talia 7-foot, headless winged man with glowing red eyes that had chased their car at over 100 miles per hour took them seriously. He got into his patrol car and followed Roger's car back out to the TNT area. As they drove back down the dark highway, a strange thing happened. The deputy's two-way radio began to crackle and hiss with a bizarre high-frequency static, a sound he had never heard before in all his years on the force. The closer they got to the old power plant, the louder and more intense the interference became, until it was an almost solid wall of electronic noise, drowning out all communication. But when they arrived at the site of the encounter, there was nothing. No creature. No giant footprints in the dust. Not a single feather, not a piece of leathery skin, not a single physical trace of any kind. There was only the cold, silent concrete monolith of the old plant, the oppressive darkness of the woods, and the lingering, undeniable feeling that something profoundly wrong had happened there. Still, something in the teenagers' raw terror had convinced Deputy Halstead. He later told reporters, "I've known these kids all their lives. They'd never been in any trouble and they were really scared that night. I took them seriously." The next day, Sheriff George Johnson held a press conference. The story was too strange, and the witnesses too credible to keep under wraps. The local paper, the Point Pleasant Register, ran the story on its front page. A wire service picked it up and sent it out across the state. An enterprising editor at a nearby newspaper, searching for a catchy headline-worthy name for the bizarre creature, recalled the immense popularity of the campy Batman television series and its rogues gallery of villains. He dubbed the red-eyed phantom the Mothman. The name was perfect. It was strange, evocative, a little bit silly, and utterly unforgettable. And it stuck. With that single headline, the private terror of four teenagers became a public phenomenon. The story exploded across the state, then the nation. And suddenly, it seemed that everyone in the Ohio Valley had a story to tell. The floodgates of the bizarre had been thrown wide open. The 13 months of fear had officially and irrevocably begun. The Scarberry and Millett sighting was the match that lit a forest fire of strangeness. In the days, weeks, and months that followed, Point Pleasant and the surrounding region were engulfed in a wave of high strangeness that went far beyond a simple monster scare. The Mothman, a creature of pure, undiluted, unexplained phenomena, had moved from the shadowed recesses of the TNT area into the very center of the town's psyche, becoming an obsession and a palpable source of terror. The very next night, November 16th, the creature made another, arguably even more terrifying appearance. Raymond Walmsley and his wife were spending the evening visiting their friends, the Bennetts. The Bennett small house was situated in a lonely, isolated spot, its backyard bleeding directly into the dark, tangled woods of the TNT area. At some point during the evening, Marcella Bennett decided to go out to her car, which was parked in the yard, to retrieve her infant daughter, Tina, who had fallen asleep in the back seat. She walked across the damp grass, the cool night air on her skin, a completely mundane and domestic act. As she reached the car and leaned inside, a strange, powerful feeling washed over her, the primal, instinctual, hair-raising feeling of being watched by an unseen predator. A large shadow shifted in her peripheral vision. She straightened up quickly and looked back toward the house. There, rising up from the ground as if from the earth itself, right behind her parked car, was a massive gray figure. It was huge, hunched over, and its eyes, she would later recount with a shudder that never quite left her, were enormous and red, glowing with a malevolent, living light of their own. They seemed to bore right through her, to paralyze her will, to hold her fast in a beam of pure terror. For a long suspended second, she was utterly frozen, paralyzed by a fear so profound it was almost sublime. Her mind simply couldn't process or categorize what her eyes were seeing. The creature took a slow, shuffling step towards her. In that moment of ultimate terror, her deep maternal instincts fought through the psychic paralysis. She dropped her child. The soft thud of her baby hitting the grass broke the spell. She let out a piercing, animalistic scream, scooped up her daughter from the ground, and scrambled frantically back towards the relative safety of the house, fumbling with the doorknob with shaking hands before slamming the door shut and bolting it behind her. Inside, the men heard her blood-curdling screams and rushed to see what was wrong. They found Marcella in a state of near-total collapse, hysterically babbling about a monster with red eyes in the yard. Raymond Walmsley, cautiously, a deep sense of dread in his stomach, peered out the front window. And he saw it. The creature was now on their front porch, its massive leathery wings folded tightly against its back, looking less like a bird and more like a grotesque, gray fallen angel. It shuffled towards the front door, its glowing red eyes scanning the front of the house as if searching for a way inside. For a long, terrifying moment, it seemed to peer directly through the window at them before it slowly turned, lumbered off the porch with an unnatural gait, and vanished into the impenetrable darkness. They immediately called the police. By the time officers arrived, sirens wailing in the distance, the creature was long gone, leaving, as always, not a single physical trace. Marcella Bennett was so deeply traumatized by the intimate, terrifying confrontation that she had to seek medical treatment for severe nervous shock and suffered from nightmares for years. This was no longer a story about something seen from a speeding car. This was a home invasion by the impossible. The Mothman wasn't just in the woods anymore. It was coming to their homes. It was standing on their porches. But another crucial and deeply tragic piece of the puzzle had fallen into place earlier that same night, just a few miles away from the Bennett house. A local man named Newell Partridge was at home, relaxing in his armchair, watching television. Suddenly, his TV screen went dark. The picture dissolved into a mesmerizing pattern of strange, swirling lines and psychedelic colors. At the same time, a loud, high-pitched whining sound, like a generator speeding up to a dangerous velocity, filled the room, seeming to emanate directly from the television set itself. As this was happening, his dog, an old and loyal German shepherd named Bandit, began to howl and bark furiously out on the front porch. The dog's frantic cries were directed towards the family's hay barn, about 150 yards from the house. Partridge, annoyed and a bit spooked, grabbed a heavy flashlight and went outside to investigate. Bandit was in a frenzy, running back and forth on the porch, his hair on end, growling and staring intently at the dark, open maw of the barn door. Partridge shone his powerful flashlight beam towards the barn. What he saw reflected back at him made his blood run cold. Two enormous, red, circular lights, like giant bicycle reflectors, stared back at him from the impenetrable darkness within the barn. An intense cold fear, a fear unlike any he had ever known, gripped him. He was an experienced hunter, a man comfortable in the woods at night, but this was different. This was profoundly unnatural. As he stood there, frozen, his loyal companion Bandit shot off the porch like a bullet, barking furiously and charging straight for the barn and the two glowing red eyes. Partridge screamed for him to come back, but the dog was gone, swallowed by the darkness. He spent several fearful minutes calling for Bandit, his voice sounding small and weak in the sudden, oppressive silence. The whining from the TV had stopped. The red eyes in the barn were gone, but Bandit did not return. A deeply unnerved Partridge, now too afraid to venture into the barn alone in the dark, went back inside, locking all the doors and spending a long sleepless night with his shotgun by his side. The next morning at first light, he went out to search for his dog. He found tracks in the mud around the barn, Bandit's familiar paw prints, circling a specific spot, and then simply vanishing, as if the dog had been snatched straight up into the air. Newell Partridge never saw his beloved dog again. When he read the newspaper accounts of the Scarberrys and the Millettes sighting the next day, and their chillingly familiar description of the creature's glowing red eyes, he felt a sickening knot of recognition and grief form in his stomach. He believed, with a terrible certainty, that he knew what had taken his dog. The sightings continued to mount, forming a bizarre and terrifyingly consistent tapestry of fear that stretched across the entire region. On November 24th, four people, including two volunteer firefighters, saw a giant winged figure soaring over the TNT area. The next day, Thomas Urey, a pragmatic and sober-minded shoe salesman, was driving along Route 62 when he saw a tall, gray, distinctly man-like figure standing in a field by the side of the road. As Urey slowed his car to get a better look, the creature spread its massive wings and, with an impossible burst of speed, ascended vertically into the sky, like a helicopter, and disappeared from view in seconds. Urey, a man not prone to flights of fancy, was so shaken that he floored it and drove straight to the sheriff's office to make a formal report. Firemen, pilots flying small private planes, housewives hanging laundry, construction workers on a job site, people from all walks of life came forward with their own incredible stories. The creature was seen perched on rooftops in residential neighborhoods, gliding silently over the Ohio River, and always, there were those two hypnotic, self-luminous red eyes. The story was now a full-blown national sensation. Journalists and television crews from New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles descended upon the small Appalachian town, turning Point Pleasant into a chaotic media circus. The community was torn. Some residents became amateur monster hunters, forming armed posses and combing the dense, treacherous woods of the TNT area, their shotguns and high-powered hunting rifles at the ready. They found nothing. No carcass, no nest, no droppings, not even a single definitive footprint. The Mothman was as tangible as smoke, as elusive as a ghost. Other residents reacted with a deep and abiding fear, locking their doors at dusk, keeping their children inside, and refusing to drive anywhere near the TNT area after dark. The town was living under a collective shadow of the unknown. And it is at this point in our story that the narrative evolves dramatically, moving from a local monster hunt into something far more complex, conspiratorial, and deeply strange. The national attention brought not just reporters looking for a sensational headline, but also seasoned investigators of the paranormal. And the most significant, dedicated, and influential of these was a man who would become the chief chronicler and theorist of the entire affair, John A. Keel. Keel was not your typical wild-eyed ghost hunter or UFO chaser. He was a respected, sharp-witted New York-based journalist and author who had made a serious career of investigating what he meticulously termed unexplained phenomena. He approached the subject not as a believer or a debunker, but with the reporter's innate skepticism and a data collector's obsession with detail. He wasn't interested in proving or disproving any single theory. He was interested in interviewing witnesses directly, finding patterns in the chaos, and documenting the full, bewildering spectrum of weirdness. He arrived in Point Pleasant in December of 1966, expecting to write a quick, entertaining article on a local monster flap that would likely fade away in a few weeks. Instead, he walked directly into the heart of a swirling vortex of high strangeness that would consume the next year of his life, challenge his entire worldview, and become the foundation of his seminal, deeply influential book, The Mothman Prophecies. Keel's methodical, respectful, and non-judgmental approach quickly earned him the trust of the shell-shocked community. People who were afraid of being ridiculed by law enforcement or the media opened up to him. He spent hundreds of hours in the living rooms and coffee shops of Point Pleasant, listening intently. And he soon discovered that the Mothman was only the tip of a very strange and very large iceberg. He found, through meticulous documentation, that the Mothman sightings were occurring in perfect parallel with the massive and unprecedented wave of UFO reports. All over the Ohio Valley, ordinary people were seeing extraordinary things in the sky. Silent, glowing orbs that maneuvered at impossible speeds and made physics-defying right-angle turns. Huge, dark, triangular or cigar-shaped objects that hovered silently over their cars on lonely roads. And bizarre formations of lights that blinked in complex, seemingly intelligent patterns. For John Keel, the Mothman and the UFOs were not two separate, unrelated mysteries. They were intrinsically linked, different but related manifestations of the same core, underlying phenomenon. His primary contact and collaborator in town was Mary Heyer, the sharp, respected, and deeply connected Point Pleasant correspondent for the Athens, Ohio Messenger newspaper. Heyer's small, cluttered office on Main Street quickly became the unofficial headquarters and clearinghouse for all things paranormal in the region. Terrified residents, reluctant to be officially on record with the police for fear of ridicule, would call Mary. They trusted her. Her phone rang off the hook at all hours of the day and night with reports of Mothman sightings, strange lights in the sky, and a new, even more disturbing and sinister phenomenon: eerie, harassing phone calls and visits from strange men. And then came the Men in Black. Long before they became a blockbuster movie franchise, the Men in Black were a chilling and persistent feature of 1950s and 60s UFO lore. In Point Pleasant, they seemed to step directly out of the shadows of fringe folklore and into terrifying reality. Witnesses who had spoken to Keel or Heyer, or who had officially reported a sighting to the police, began to receive visits from profoundly strange and deeply intimidating individuals. The accounts of these encounters, collected by Keel from numerous unconnected witnesses, are unnervingly and frighteningly consistent. The men almost always traveled in pairs or threes. They drove immaculate, large black cars, often older model Cadillacs, Buicks, or Chryslers that looked brand new, as if they had just rolled off a 1950s assembly line despite being over a decade old. The men themselves were even stranger. They were often described as having an unnaturally dark or sallow olive complexion, with stiff, plastic-like skin and unnaturally high cheekbones. Their facial features were often described as vaguely oriental or exotic, yet they didn't seem to belong to any recognizable human ethnicity. They wore pristine, old-fashioned black suits, crisp white shirts, and black ties. But their clothes were often described as being made of a strange, shiny, stiff material that didn't seem to wrinkle or hold dust. Their behavior was the most unsettling part of the encounters. They spoke in a flat, emotionless, robotic monotone, often using oddly formal, stilted, or archaic language, as if they had learned English from an old textbook. They seemed profoundly uncomfortable and unfamiliar with the human world, fumbling with simple objects like pens, doorknobs, or silverware. They would ask bizarre, nonsensical questions, or feign ignorance about common foods or customs. Their purpose, however, was always deadly serious and crystal clear. They would identify themselves with vague credentials, claiming to be from the Air Force, the Missing Persons Bureau, or a non-existent government agency. They would then interrogate witnesses about their sightings, often displaying an impossible, terrifying knowledge of the witness's personal life, referencing private conversations or details that no stranger could possibly know. And then they would deliver a clear, chilling, and often direct warning. Do not speak of what you saw to anyone, ever again. John Keel and Mary Hyre experienced this harassment firsthand and on a daily basis. They felt they were being watched constantly. Their phone lines became a conduit for high strangeness. They would experience bizarre clicks, hums, loud electronic screeches, and strange, overlapping voices during their conversations. Sometimes they would answer the phone to hear nothing but heavy rasping, inhuman breathing on the other end. Other times a metallic, synthesized, inhuman voice would speak gibberish, utter cryptic, threatening phrases, or even play back recordings of their own previous conversations. Keel became utterly convinced that his every move was being monitored by this shadowy, unsettling, and non-human intelligence. This element pushes the Mothman story far beyond the simple realm of cryptozoology, the search for unknown animals. If this was just a big, weird bird that had wandered off its migration path, why would mysterious quasi-governmental agents be systematically intimidating witnesses into silence? Who were these men in black? Were they a secret government task force trying to cover up the existence of a new biological species, or perhaps a piece of advanced experimental drone technology? Or were they something else entirely, something not of this world? For John Keel, this was all part of the same grand, baffling, and interconnected tapestry. He began to develop a radical paradigm-shifting theory. He came to believe that the Mothman, the UFOs, and the men in black were not extraterrestrial, that is, not from another planet in our physical universe. He proposed that they were ultra-terrestrial beings from another dimension, a parallel reality that coexists with our own, just outside the narrow band of our sensory perception. These entities, he theorized, could manipulate energy and matter, appearing to us in whatever form they chose, or whatever form our own minds could process. They were cosmic tricksters, psychic chameleons, and their reality could temporarily intersect with ours, particularly in places he called window areas, geographic locations like Point Pleasant, where paranormal phenomena seemed to cluster and manifest for concentrated periods. They could appear as angels, demons, little green men in silver suits, or in this case as a 7-foot-tall winged monster with glowing red eyes. Their motives were utterly unknowable. Their logic was alien, and their presence was a sign that the veil between worlds was growing thin. As the long, strange year of 1967 wore on, a palpable sense of dread, a psychic heaviness, began to settle over the town of Point Pleasant. The Mothman sightings themselves grew more sporadic, but they also grew more focused and ominous. The creature was now frequently seen in and around one specific critical location: the Silver Bridge. Multiple, credible witnesses reported seeing it perched high on the steel superstructure, its red eyes glowing like malevolent embers in the twilight, looking down on the river and the steady stream of traffic below. The strange lights in the sky continued their silent, nightly patrols, often seen hovering directly over the bridge. And a new, deeply disturbing element began to emerge with increasing frequency: premonitions of a great and terrible disaster. Both John Keel and Mary Hyre started receiving a deluge of phone calls and letters, not just from terrified locals but from people all over the country who had become psychically attuned to the Point Pleasant story. These people were having terrifyingly specific and repetitive dreams and visions. They dreamed of a great tragedy on the river. They dreamed of drowning, of screaming faces in the black water, of cars and bodies trapped in twisted metal, and most bizarrely and consistently, of Christmas presents and toys floating amidst the debris. Mary Hyre herself confided in Keel that she was being plagued by a recurring nightmare of a big, dark tragedy on the river, that she knew with a chilling certainty, was coming before Christmas. The feeling of impending doom became so strong and pervasive in the town that some residents began to consciously, actively avoid the Silver Bridge. They couldn't explain it logically. It was just a feeling, a deep, primal, gut-wrenching instinct that something was terribly, fundamentally wrong with it. John Keel became thoroughly convinced that all the bizarre, disparate phenomena of the past 13 months were not random. He saw it as a clear, albeit terrifying, countdown. He believed the ultra-terrestrials were, in their own cryptic, clumsy, and terrifying way, trying to issue a warning to the people of the valley. But a warning about what, precisely? He didn't know for sure. He only knew that the psychic energy in Point Pleasant felt charged to the absolute breaking point. Like the heavy, metallic, ozone-filled air just seconds before a massive lightning strike. Then came Friday, December 15, 1967. It was a cold, gray, overcast evening just 10 days before Christmas. The town was alive with the cheerful bustle of the holiday season. Wreaths hung on doors and festive lights twinkled in the windows of the shops on Main Street. At the end of the workday, the evening rush hour traffic began to build on the Silver Bridge. Cars, trucks, and massive, fully loaded tractor-trailers, filled with goods for the holidays and people heading home for the weekend, packed the bridge bumper to bumper. Its 39-year-old steel frame was under a heavy, grinding, and relentless load. At approximately 4:58 p.m., a sound like a single sharp metallic rifle shot cracked through the cold evening air and echoed across the river. For one horrifying suspended silent second the bridge held. Then with a deafening groaning screaming roar of tortured, twisting metal, the northern suspension chain snapped. A single critical piece of steel, a 2.5-inch diameter eye-bar, known as eye-bar 330, had failed due to a microscopic stress crack. The catastrophic failure of that one single piece initiated a horrifying domino effect. One by one, the other eye-bars in the chain, now bearing an impossible instantaneous weight, broke apart like pretzels. The entire central span of the Silver Bridge, the proud artery of the community, contorted, twisted, buckled, and collapsed with unimaginable violence into the frigid, dark, and fast-moving waters of the Ohio River. It took less than a minute for the entire structure to disappear beneath the waves. 31 vehicles plunged with it into the icy abyss. The scene was an apocalypse. Cars were crushed and mangled, their headlights casting a ghostly, fleeting glow beneath the surface before winking out forever. People were thrown from their vehicles into the lethally cold water, while others were trapped in a tomb of twisted steel and concrete. The swift, powerful river current and the tangled, razor-sharp wreckage created a deadly underwater maze that hampered the desperate rescue efforts. In the end, 46 people lost their lives. 2 of their bodies were never recovered from the river's cold grasp. The town of Point Pleasant was utterly shattered, plunged into a state of profound shock and deep collective grief. The symbol of their community's strength and progress had become a mass grave. In the numbing, grief-stricken aftermath, as the town mourned its dead and a massive federal investigation began, a strange and eerie silence descended upon the valley. Amidst the sorrow and the search for answers, one stark and chilling fact became undeniably clear to John Keel, Mary Hyre, and the dozens of witnesses who had been living in fear for over a year. The Mothman was gone. After 13 months of terrorizing and mystifying the community, the sightings abruptly and completely stopped. The strange lights vanished from the night sky. The menacing, static-filled phone calls ceased. Mary Hyre's phone in her newspaper office fell silent. It was as if the creature's purpose, whatever it had been, was now fulfilled. The curtain had fallen on the strangest, most terrifying chapter in the history of Point Pleasant. And it is here, in this tragic confluence of events, that the legend truly hardens and crystallizes, transforming from a simple monster story into something far more profound, disturbing, and enduringly haunting. The central question was no longer simply, what is the Mothman? The question became, with a chilling urgency, why was the Mothman here? The timing was too precise, too poetically terrible, too perfect, to be dismissed by those who had lived it as a mere staggering coincidence. A terrifying otherworldly creature appears, haunts the very area of a future disaster for over a year, with many sightings on or near the structure itself, and then vanishes from the face of the earth the very moment that disaster occurs. Suddenly, the entire Mothman phenomenon was recast in a new, terrifying light. The premonitions of drowning, the dreams of a river tragedy filled with floating Christmas toys, the creature's own strange fixation on the Bridgite all clicked into a horrifying but coherent new narrative. Was the Mothman a malevolent, demonic force that had somehow, through psychic or physical means, caused the collapse? Or was it something far more tragic and complex? Was it a misunderstood messenger, a true harbinger of doom, a dark, Cassandra-like angel trying desperately, in the only way it knew how, to warn the people of Point Pleasant of a catastrophe it could foresee but was powerless to prevent? Perhaps its terrifying appearance, the frantic chase, the hypnotic red eyes, perhaps that was the only way an alien consciousness knew how to scream danger into our limited human perception. This central unanswerable question is what elevates the Mothman legend from a regional curiosity to a cornerstone of American folklore. It forces us to step to the edge of our comfortable reality and to analyze the competing explanations, from the coldly scientific to the profoundly deeply strange. First, let us rigorously examine the most rational, skeptical, and scientific explanation for the creature itself: misidentification. Biologists and ornithologists, when confronted with the story, have long proposed that the Mothman was simply a large, out-of-place bird, its features exaggerated by fear and darkness. The primary candidate, and the one most often cited, is the sandhill crane. These are indeed magnificent and large birds, standing nearly 5 feet tall with an impressive wingspan that can exceed 7 feet. Crucially, they have a prominent patch of bright red, featherless skin around their eyes which, in poor light or when illuminated by the sudden glare of headlights, could be mistaken for glowing. They also emit a strange, rattling, croaking call that could be perceived as unnatural. The theory posits that a small, disoriented population of these cranes, perhaps thrown off their usual migration path, may have taken up temporary residence in the secluded, food-rich environment of the TNT area, which was a designated wildlife refuge. Witnesses, caught by surprise in the dark, their adrenaline pumping, simply and unconsciously exaggerated the size and features of what they saw. The great horned owl, with its large forward-facing eyes that create powerful eyeshine, and its silent flight, is another, less common candidate. This theory has the undeniable virtue of simplicity and scientific plausibility. It requires no new laws of physics or tears in the fabric of reality. However, it strains credulity to the breaking point when held up against the specific, consistent, and detailed witness testimonies. Not one but dozens of credible, sober, unrelated witnesses described a creature that was distinctly man-shaped, with a discernible torso, shoulders, and folded wings on its back, not a bird's classic profile. They consistently described a creature that was 6.5 to 7 feet tall, far larger than even the most generous estimates for a sandhill crane. And most damningly, no known bird on Earth can silently pace a car traveling at 100 miles per hour or ascend vertically into the sky like a helicopter. To accept the misidentification theory, you have to systematically dismiss the most consistent, most extraordinary, and most crucial details from nearly every key witness account as mere fantasy or exaggeration. This leads us to the second major theory, a psychological one: mass hysteria or collective delusion. This theory suggests that the phenomenon was psychologically real, but its origin was in the mind of the community, not in the woods of the TNT area. The 1960s were a time of immense and pervasive societal anxiety. The Cold War was at its height. The existential threat of nuclear annihilation was a constant background hum in daily life. And the divisive Vietnam War was escalating, sending a generation of young men to a distant, bloody conflict. In a small, relatively isolated, and economically stressed Appalachian community, this potent brew of national anxiety could easily curdle into something more specific and localized. The initial highly publicized sighting by the Scarberrys and the Miletus for credible, normal young people who were genuinely and profoundly terrified planted a powerful seed of suggestion in the fertile soil of the town's psyche. The media, with the catchy and memorable Mothman name, fanned the flames, creating a self-perpetuating legend. After that, the powerful psychological principles of confirmation bias and suggestibility took over. Every strange shadow, every pair of animal eyes caught in headlights, every large owl or heron taking flight at dusk, was interpreted through the pre-existing narrative of the Mothman. The genuinely spooky, decaying atmosphere of the TNT area provided the perfect stage for this psychological drama to unfold. The fear was real, the terror was genuine, but the monster was a projection, a shared hallucination given shape and substance by the power of story. This theory elegantly explains the complete and total lack of physical evidence. You can't find a feather from a phantom, but it struggles to explain the sheer consistency of the descriptions, often from witnesses who hadn't yet been exposed to media reports. And it completely fails to provide a rational explanation for the vast array of ancillary phenomena, the specific, documented, and eerily accurate premonitions of a river disaster, the massive UFO flap, the deeply strange men in black encounters, or the tragic physical disappearance of Newell Partridge's dog. This brings us to the third, most famous, most provocative, and most enduring explanation, that of the paranormal harbinger. This is the theory born from the meticulous, on-the-ground research of John Keel, and since embraced by global folklore. It posits that the Mothman was a genuine, objective phenomenon, but one that belongs entirely to the realm of the paranormal or supernatural. It was not a biological creature to be catalogued by science, but an ultra-terrestrial entity, a visitor from another dimension, a tear in the veil. And its purpose in Point Pleasant was not to cause harm, but to issue a warning. In this stunning interpretation, all the high strangeness of those 13 months is part of a single coherent, albeit terrifying, message. These non-human entities, Keel theorized, are drawn to the immense energy of future disasters and human trauma like moths to a flame. Their presence bleeds through into our reality, causing a cascade of paranormal events, what Keel termed the window effect. The Mothman was the most visible and terrifying sign, but the strange lights in the sky, the menacing phone calls, the prophetic dreams, and even the bizarre, intimidating men in black were all ripples from the same profound disturbance in the fabric of reality. The creature's constant, obsessive fixation on the Silver Bridge wasn't random. It was drawn to the focal point of the coming tragedy. Its complete and instantaneous disappearance at the exact moment of the bridge's collapse is the powerful, chilling, and undeniable linchpin of this theory. Its work was done. The warning had been sent, the prophecy had tragically been fulfilled, and the window between worlds had slammed shut. This narrative, while extraordinary and mind-bending, is the only one that even attempts to connect every single bizarre, disparate, and well-documented thread of the Point Pleasant saga into a single cohesive whole. The official government investigation into the disaster, of course, found no evidence of ultraterrestrials or dark prophecies. The final sober report from the Presidential Task Force on the Silver Bridge collapse was a sobering and tragic document of mundane engineering failure. The cause was traced with scientific certainty to a single, flawed eye-bar in the northern suspension chain. A microscopic stress corrosion crack, just 1/10 of an inch deep, had formed over the bridge's 40-year lifespan due to a combination of factors, including the type of steel used and environmental exposure. This tiny, fatal flaw, completely invisible to the naked eye and undetectable by the inspection methods of the day, grew slowly, silently, year after year, until the combination of cold temperatures and the heavy bumper-to-bumper holiday traffic of December 15, 1967, provided the final fatal strain. The Silver Bridge fell because of metal fatigue, and the unforeseen limits of 1920s engineering. It was a mundane, preventable, and utterly human tragedy. And so we are left with two starkly different narratives, running in parallel, a duality that defines the Mothman legend. One is a story of science and steel, of load capacities and stress fractures in metallurgical analysis. The other is a story of folklore and fear, of red-eyed omens and dark, fulfilled prophecies. For the hardened skeptic, these two stories are entirely separate and unconnected. The Mothman was a year-long mirage of mass hysteria and misidentification that, through a staggering 1 in a billion coincidence, happened to precede an unrelated engineering disaster. The human brain, a pattern-seeking machine hardwired to find meaning in chaos, simply forced a connection that wasn't there in order to give a narrative shape to a senseless, random tragedy. But for the believer, for the people who lived through that year of inexplicable fear, and for the countless millions who have been captivated by the legend ever since, that connection is the entire point of the story. The official report explains how the bridge fell. The Mothman legend grapples with a much deeper, more resonant, and more human question of why. It offers a chilling, yet in a strange way, comforting sense of order to the universe. It suggests that the universe is not a cold, random, indifferent machine, but a place alive with mystery and forces beyond our comprehension, that even in our most profound moments of loss and tragedy, we are not entirely alone. Today, more than half a century later, the Mothman is more famous than ever. A global icon of cryptozoology, urban legends, and the unexplained. The town of Point Pleasant has forged a complex, fascinating, and ultimately beneficial relationship with its former tormentor. The raw fear has faded, replaced by a unique and quirky brand of civic pride. On Main Street, you can visit the one-of-a-kind Mothman Museum, a place filled with original police reports, newspaper clippings, detailed witness accounts, and props from the Hollywood movie adaptation of Keel's book. A block away, a magnificent 12-foot-tall polished steel statue of the creature stands in the center of town, its metallic wings spread wide and its piercing red eyes staring out over the community it once terrorized. And every September, the town throws a massive party for its monster. The Mothman Festival is a joyous carnival-like event that draws thousands upon thousands of tourists, paranormal investigators, artists, and curiosity seekers from all over the world. The terror of 1966 has been transformed into a cultural and economic engine for the 21st century. But beneath the festive atmosphere, the Mothman-themed hot dogs, and the souvenir t-shirts, the legend of the Mothman remains inextricably and somberly bound to the memory of the 46 men, women, and children who lost their lives on that cold December evening. A quiet, beautifully maintained memorial on the riverbank lists their names, a place of silent, solemn counterpoint to the gleaming monster statue nearby. The story endures, passed from generation to generation, not because it is merely a scary tale to be told around a campfire, but because it touches upon our most fundamental and timeless human questions and fears. The fear of the dark, the fear of the unknown, and the deep, abiding, and desperate human need to believe that our lives and our deaths have meaning, that great tragedies cast a long shadow before they arrive, that there is more to this world than what we can see and measure. And then came the Men in Black. Long before they were a blockbuster movie franchise, the Men in Black were a staple of UFO lore. And in Point Pleasant, they seemed to become chillingly real. Witnesses who had seen the Mothman or UFOs began reporting visits from strange, intimidating men. They often traveled in pristine black vintage cars, usually Cadillacs, that looked brand new despite being years or even decades old. The men themselves were described in unervingly similar ways. They had dark complexions, sometimes described as an unnatural tan, and stiff, plastic-like skin. Their features were often vaguely oriental or exotic, but in a way that didn't seem to fit any known ethnicity. They wore immaculate black suits, but the fabric was sometimes described as strangely shiny or stiff, and the cut was old-fashioned. Their behavior was even stranger. They spoke in a flat, monotone, almost robotic voice. They often seemed unfamiliar with common objects, asking strange questions or fumbling with everyday items like pens or cutlery. They would claim to be from the government or the Air Force, but when checked, their credentials were fake. Their purpose seemed to be singular: to intimidate witnesses into silence. They would ask detailed questions about a witness's sighting, then subtly or not so subtly warn them not to speak about it to anyone else ever again. Some witnesses reported that these men in black seemed to know things about them that no stranger could possibly know, referencing private conversations or personal details. John Keel himself reported being followed and harassed by these figures. He would receive bizarre phone calls where the person on the other end would speak in a metallic, inhuman voice, or sometimes just breathe heavily. The lines to his and Mary Hyer's phones would click, hiss, and produce strange electronic tones. They felt they were being watched, monitored by an unseen and unsettling intelligence. This element of the story deepens the mystery far beyond a simple case of cryptozoologists' search for hidden or unknown animals. Was the government secretly investigating the Mothman? Or were these men in black something else entirely? For Keel, they were part of the same ultra-terrestrial phenomenon. He came to believe that the Mothman, the UFOs, and the men in black were not from outer space, but from a parallel reality, a dimension that coexists with our own. He theorized that these entities were tricksters, beings that could manipulate our perception of reality, appearing in whatever form would have the most psychological impact, whether as angels, aliens, or a terrifying winged monster. As 1967 wore on, the town of Point Pleasant lived in a state of simmering anxiety. The Mothman sightings became less frequent but no less strange. The creature was sometimes seen near the Silver Bridge, perched on the superstructure. Strange lights continued to dance in the night sky. And a new, more disturbing element began to surface: premonitions of disaster. Both John Keel and Mary Hyer started receiving reports from locals, and even from people far away who had read about Point Pleasant, who were having terrifying prophetic dreams. The dreams were often about a great tragedy involving the river. People dreamed of drowning, of screaming faces in the dark water, of Christmas presents floating amidst debris. Mary Hyer herself confessed to Keel that she had a recurring nightmare of a big dark tragedy on the river. The feeling of impending doom grew so strong in the town that some residents began to actively avoid the Silver Bridge, taking longer routes to cross the Ohio River. They couldn't explain why. It was just a feeling, a deep gnawing dread. Keel became convinced that all the bizarre phenomena of the past year, the Mothman, the UFOs, the strange calls, were building towards a climax. He felt that these ultra-terrestrials were, in their own cryptic way, trying to issue a warning. But a warning about what? He didn't know. He only knew that the energy in Point Pleasant felt charged, like the air before a violent thunderstorm. Then came December 15, 1967. It was a Friday evening, just 10 days before Christmas. The town was bustling with holiday shoppers. The weather was cold and gray. And on the Silver Bridge, rush hour traffic was at its peak. Cars, trucks, and tractor trailers were packed bumper to bumper, their occupants heading home for the weekend, their minds on last-minute shopping and holiday plans. The bridge, which had stood as a symbol of strength and connection for nearly 40 years, was under maximum load. At approximately 5 p.m., a sound like a rifle shot cracked through the cold evening air. A single critical piece of steel on the bridge's 55-foot-long I-bar in the northern suspension chain snapped. For a horrifying moment, nothing happened. Then, a chain reaction of catastrophic failure began. One by one, the remaining I-bars, now under an impossible strain, broke apart. With the deafening grinding roar that witnesses would never forget, the entire central span of the Silver Bridge buckled and twisted. In less than a minute, the proud landmark contorted into a mangled wreck of steel and concrete and plunged into the frigid, dark waters of the Ohio River. 31 vehicles fell with it. The scene was one of unimaginable horror. Cars were crushed, their headlights glowing eerily beneath the surface before being extinguished. People were trapped in their submerged vehicles, while others were thrown into the icy water. Rescuers scrambled to the scene, but the conditions were treacherous. The swift current and the tangled razor-sharp wreckage made recovery efforts a nightmare. In the end, 46 people lost their lives. 2 of the victims were never found. The town of Point Pleasant was plunged into a state of shock and profound grief. The lifeline of their community had become a mass grave. The symbol of their pride had become a monument to tragedy. In the aftermath of the collapse, a strange silence fell over the town. Amidst the grief and the federal investigation, one thing became starkly apparent. The Mothman was gone. After 13 months of terrifying the community, the sightings stopped. The strange lights in the sky vanished. The weird phone calls ceased. It was as if the creature's purpose, whatever it had been, was fulfilled. The curtain had fallen on the strangest chapter in Point Pleasant's history. And this is where the legend crystallizes into its most enduring and haunting form. The question was no longer, what is the Mothman? But why was it here? The timing was too perfect, too chilling to be a mere coincidence. The creature had appeared, haunted the town for a year, and then vanished at the exact moment of its greatest tragedy. Suddenly, the premonitions of disaster reported to Keel and Hire took on a terrifying significance. The Mothman, once seen as a monster, was recast in a new light by many. Was it a malevolent entity that somehow caused the collapse? Or was it something else entirely, a tragic, misunderstood messenger? A harbinger of doom trying to warn the people of Point Pleasant of the impending catastrophe? A kind of dark angel whose terrifying appearance was a desperate, failed attempt to communicate a future it could see but not prevent? This is the central debate that elevates the Mothman from a simple monster story to a profound piece of American folklore, a cornerstone of cryptozoology and the study of unexplained phenomena. Let's analyze the theories, from the mundane to the extraordinary. First, we have the most skeptical and scientific explanation: misidentification. The leading candidate proposed by biologists and skeptics is the sandhill crane. This is a very large bird, with a wingspan that can reach over 7 feet and a height approaching 5 feet. Crucially, some sandhill cranes have a patch of bright red skin around their eyes, which could, under the right lighting conditions, appear to glow. They also have a strange, rattling cry. Proponents of this theory suggest that a few of these cranes, perhaps disoriented or flying outside their normal migration patterns, were spotted by locals who, caught off guard in the dark, exaggerated their size and features. However, this theory has significant problems. While large, a sandhill crane is not 7 feet tall. Witnesses consistently described a creature that was man-shaped, not bird-shaped. They described wings that folded against a back, not feathered wings on the side. Most importantly, no bird on Earth can pace a car going 100 miles per hour. The flight characteristics described by witnesses, vertical takeoff, silent gliding at high speeds, simply don't match any known avian species. Another candidate, the great horned owl, has been suggested due to its large, seemingly glowing eyes and nocturnal habits. But again, the size and shape described by so many independent witnesses just don't fit. The second major theory is mass hysteria or collective delusion. This psychological explanation suggests that after the initial highly publicized sighting by the Scarberrys and Millettes, the power of suggestion took over the town. In this view, a combination of factors created a perfect storm for a shared delusion. You had a small, somewhat isolated community. You had the genuinely spooky atmosphere of the abandoned TNT area. You had the anxieties of the Cold War era. The first story, amplified by the media, planted a seed in the town's collective consciousness. Afterward, every strange shadow, every pair of headlights reflecting off an animal's eyes, every large bird seen at dusk, was interpreted through the lens of the Mothman legend. This theory is compelling because it acknowledges the reality of the witness's fear, without requiring the existence of a real monster. The terror was genuine, but its source was internal, projected onto ambiguous stimuli. It explains why no physical evidence was ever found. The monster wasn't in the TNT area. It was in the minds of the people looking for it. However, it struggles to account for the consistency of the descriptions from people who often hadn't heard the other stories in detail. It also doesn't explain the ancillary phenomena, like the men in black or the specific, documented premonitions of a river disaster. This brings us to the third and most famous explanation, the paranormal harbinger. This is the theory championed by John Keel and embraced by the folklore surrounding the Mothman. In this view, the Mothman is a real non-human entity. It is not an animal to be classified by biology, but a being that operates outside our known laws of physics and reality. Its purpose in Point Pleasant was not to terrorize, but to warn. According to this theory, the creature's frightening appearance, the red eyes, the chassis was all part of a desperate, alien form of communication. These ultra-terrestrial beings, Keel argued, foresee moments of great trauma and disaster. They are drawn to these locations, and their presence leaks through into our reality, causing a wide spectrum of paranormal events. The Mothman was the most visible manifestation, but the UFOs, the weird phone calls, and the prophetic dreams were all part of the same signal, that something terrible was about to happen. The creature's disappearance immediately after the Silver Bridge collapse is the linchpin of this theory. Job was done. The warning had been issued, and tragically, the disaster had come to pass. This interpretation provides a narrative that connects all the disparate, high-strangeness events of those 13 months into a single coherent, albeit supernatural story. The official investigation into the bridge collapse, of course, found a much more mundane culprit. Engineers determined that the cause was a stress corrosion crack in a single eyeberry bar 330. It was a tiny flaw just 1/10 of an inch deep, in a piece of steel that had been under constant stress for 40 years. The technology of 1928 simply hadn't accounted for this type of slow microscopic failure. It was a tragic accident born of aging infrastructure and the limits of engineering at the time. There was no monster, no conspiracy, just physics and metal fatigue. And so we are left with two parallel stories. One is a story of science and engineering, of stress fractures and load capacities. The other is a story of folklore and fear, of red-eyed monsters and dark prophecies. For the skeptic, the two stories are entirely separate. The Mothman was a year-long phantom of mass hysteria that, by a 1 in a million chance, coincided with a preventable engineering disaster. The human mind, desperate to find meaning in tragedy, simply wove the two events together after the fact. But for the believer, and for those who lived through it, the connection is undeniable. The official explanation describes how the bridge fell. The Mothman legend attempts to explain why. It offers a sense of order, however terrifying, to a chaotic and senseless loss of life. It suggests that there are forces at work beyond our comprehension, that the universe is not as empty and random as it seems. Today, the legend of the Mothman is more potent than ever. It has become a global icon of urban legends, and one of the most famous subjects in the field of cryptozoology. Point Pleasant has, in a strange way, embraced its monster. There is a Mothman museum in the center of town. A polished 12-foot-tall steel statue of the creature stands as a popular tourist attraction. Every year, the town hosts the Mothman Festival, drawing thousands of visitors, paranormal investigators, and curiosity seekers from around the world. The terror of 1966 has transformed into a cultural and economic touchstone. But beneath the festivals and the t-shirts, the shadow of the Mothman still lingers, tied inextricably to the memory of the 46 people who perished on that cold December evening. The story endures not just because it's a scary monster tale, but because it touches upon our deepest fears and questions. Fear of the dark, fear of the unknown, and the desperate human need to believe that even in our darkest moments of tragedy, There is some kind of meaning, some kind of pattern, that we are not entirely alone in a cold, indifferent universe. Was the Mothman a misidentified bird? A phantom born of fear and suggestion in a small town on edge? Or was it a true harbinger of doom? A dark sentinel trying to warn of a tragedy it was powerless to stop? The case remains one of the most compelling and haunting examples of unexplained phenomena in American history. The evidence is anecdotal, the theories are unprovable, and the truth, like the creature itself, remains maddeningly elusive, forever hidden in the shadows of Point Pleasant. Thank you for joining us on this journey into one of America's greatest urban legends. What do you think is the truth behind the Mothman of Point Pleasant? Was it a creature, a premonition, or a case of collective anxiety? Let us know your theories in the comments below. We read every single one. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the unexplained, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more explorations into the mysteries that lie just beneath the surface of our world. Until next time, sleep well.